Chapter 3. For a moment, Berthold was sure Eadon was about to pull a knife from his apron and come at him with it. Instead, he stormed out, leaving him alone in the scullery. After a minute, another trio of porters burst in and dumped their flatware loads into the big metal basin, now stacked high above the grimy layer of soap scum on its surface. They said nothing, but the looks they gave him were as dirty as the plates they left behind. A sense of urgency gripped him as Berthold realized he couldn't afford to stand around on the clock. He would not be drawn into Eadon's bickering ways and the probable outcome of docked or delayed pay for shirking his responsibilities. His job was to wash, Eadon's was to dry. If Eadon wasn't here to do his share, that wasn't his fault. All he could do was get on with his half and see how things went. Berthold moved over to the porcelain pyramid and picked off the saucer that stood as its capstone. Black sauce trails streaked its white facade like mascara tears that dissolved as he dunked it into the water, which was hot but not unbearable to his skin. An assortment of brushes with multifaceted heads and uniquely angled handles were on hand, but since he couldn't distinguish one from another, he picked a brush with a flat head and sturdy bristles and went to work. Time moved faster once he had mastered the inventory of his workstation and settled into a rhythm. Porters came and went at variable intervals, the shorter ones piling on the pressure as the heap grew afresh just as he had begun to make a dent in it. Unexpectedly, Eadon reappeared and assumed his duties wordlessly, where his experience showed as he towel-whipped his way through the drying backlog with ease. His resumption was timely as Rouge passed through their adjacent corridor with a huge casserole tray, borne aloft towards one of the giant ovens in the stone back ends. Rouge's jowly face was flushed pink. He was humming loudly to himself and didn't so much as glance at the two scullions. Berthold saw the look in his eye of a man entirely about his business, and business was good. Busyness was his watchword too, as dining patronage approached its peak, and he found himself scrubbing harder and faster to keep up with the larger and more frequent loads. The water in the main basin had become too murky to justify its use, but he was unsure of where to dispose of it. "Eadon," he began, trying to sound as neutral as possible. Berthold saw Eadon's punched-out eyes flicker at the sound of his name. Otherwise, he gave no reaction, but continued to pull plates from the stack and dry them off with a towel with the same efficacious nonchalance. "This needs fresh water. Where do we dispose of the dirty stuff?" Silence ensued. It grew ever more pointed as the question hung unanswered. Berthold sighed. It was a good thing his first day on the job would be his last. This was juvenile behaviour he wouldn't have been allowed to get away with past the age of 5 back on the farm. Spite was the name of this game, and his part was simple. Engage Eadon in any way, preferably in a neutral tone and reasonable manner, so the courtesies could be flung back in his face like trimmings in a food fight. Knowing its futility in the back of his mind, Berthold still could not help himself in extending an olive branch of reason. "Look, Eadon, we got off to a bad start, and with just over an hour to go it might seem pointless, but I'd like to do this job properly while I'm here. You know how this place works, where everything goes. Let's just be men about this and get it done. Then we'll be quits as I quit. I just want to get paid for tonight so I can afford my room tomorrow before I leave town. How about it?" Berthold stuck out his hand with an open palm to shake on it. A strong move against someone so committed to his petty antagonism, one he judged would force a reaction out of him one way or another. Rakamazu's tome had much to say about primal forces, symbols, motions, and the philosophy surrounding their use. Certain behaviours transcended the rational by tapping into the grand unconscious mind of life, whose primeval memories recognized this universal gesture of benevolence with the solemnity of the ages themselves. In short, only a committed ass refused a handshake. The result was entirely as Berthold had expected, so he was not overly disappointed when Eadon turned to him, looked him straight in the eyes, and told him where to shove it. Committed indeed. He sighed again, and resolved to figure it out himself. Talking to this imbecile was nothing but a waste of time. Berthold couldn't believe someone could be so needlessly recalcitrant over something as trivial as an evening's hired help getting paid up front. He suspected Eadon was using him as a scapegoat for all his self-inflicted histrionics, precisely because there would be no consequence to him being wholly uncooperative as a freshly branded mule. "Aren't you worried this will reflect badly on you? Do you not care if you're sacked? Why not quit and find another job you want to do instead of shirking this one?" Then something happened Berthold hadn't expected. Eadon turned and smiled at him. It was a watery smile, full of thinly veiled contempt. Nonetheless, he took the acknowledgement as a tentatively good sign. A window of communication was now cracked, and Eadon had opened it willingly. Perhaps the snarling whelp had, at length, managed to rein in his temper enough for the thread of Berthold's persuasion to take hold. Eadon's problem, his defect, was obvious. Self-loathing seeped out of him like the scent of manure from Farmer Odd's leaky silos Berthold had helped fix up last summer. Perhaps he could use this to his advantage, Berthold thought, as his mind pondered the possible angles he could take. Coming in hard, trying to leverage Eadon's position against him, hadn't worked out as he'd hoped. In a bizarre inversion of priorities, he, Berthold, seemed to care more about doing his due diligence for 2 hours bit work than Eadon did prolonging what might be the sum total of his career. Then again, Berthold thought as he glanced around the oppressive confines and casual squalor of his workstation, he'd be cantankerous if this was all he had to look forward to day after day. Still, a king lost no sleep over the wretched lives of his most pitiful servants. That was simply their way of living.
"Oh no, you're right. I don't want to lose my job,"
Eadon said woefully as he shook his head with his eyes closed. He didn't sound especially sincere, but Berthold was willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. "Then let's do this. Time's a-wasting, and I have somewhere to be after I'm done here." And so they began working together, tensely at first, acclimating to one another's presence and methods slowly as the minutes dripped away like so much soapy water over the side of the first basin. Eadon drained the dirty water into buckets that he disposed of somewhere when the time came for them to switch roles. Berthold thought to ask where, then decided it didn't matter for the time he had left here. The changeover was timely, as porter activity increased, an uptick Eadon did not fail to notice, and voice his irritation at the unfairness of being given second shift. Half an hour went by without incident. Berthold felt encouraged as the finish line grew closer than it was further away. Eadon was quicker on the drying than the washing, but kept pace. A big stack of porcelain grew higher and higher on the drying rack counter that was his workstation. Berthold leaned into the hub and peered into its various niches and corridors. Noise and activity abounded, but there were no porters to be seen. "Stack's building up," Berthold said to Eadon, more awkwardly than he would have liked. He had been trying to keep it light, and hoped Eadon wouldn't sidetrack them with defensive bickering again this close to the end of his shift. All in all, it hadn't gone too badly, he supposed. The thought sent a cold wave of precursive regret up his spine for such careless optimism. "Ah." "Do you know where the porters are?"
"Ah."
Eadon grunted through his concentration as he scrubbed away at a piece of fish skin that had stuck to the plate he was cleaning. A trio from the previous load had sat on the stack on their dolly long enough to fuse themselves together. Prizing them apart left a butterfly imprint of congealed grease and fried batter that proved difficult to shift, even with dedicated abrasion. "Magic would do it," came the thought from the voice in the back of his mind. Berthold couldn't argue with it. Magic was superior to muscle in many ways, but muscle could do things without magic, and so the flesh could not be neglected, as was traditional in some practitioners of the arcane. Berthold reminded himself he was not a wizard, nor did he want anyone to brand him as one. "Eadon, this stack of plates is getting a little high for my liking. We need to find some porters to move them."
"Yeah."
"Do you know where we could find them? I already got lost in here earlier, and don't want Rouge to think I've been slacking off by wandering around."
"Somewhere, I suppose."
"Could you be a little more specific?"
"Like what?"
"Where do the porters take these plates? Where are they stored?"
"I dunno."
"Surely you must know."
I said I don't know.
Okay, fine. You don't know. We still need to do something about it. Could you ask one of the cooks?
Stop telling me what to do. You don't even work here.
Exactly my point. You do. So you're in a better position to ask someone else who knows. I thought we'd agreed to work together, Eadon. Is that too much to ask from you for 2 hours?
You ain't going to talk to me like that no more. I'm done with you.
Berthold had the terrible feeling he was either dealing with a genuinely sad specimen of a human being, or that he was being given the runaround by someone to whom casual deception came easily. It was a poor indictment in either case, doubly so that the distinction between them was so nebulous. He was beginning to see why people like this ended up in places like these. There really was nowhere else for them. Fine, I'll go look myself. Berthold didn't trust the counter or the rack to keep such precarious towers stable. Both were old and warped by the constant exposure to heat and moisture. That was as it was, but they had too many dishes mounting up and no room to stack new ones except on top of the others. He stepped out into the grimy hub, grateful to be out of the scullery, which was little more than a steamy closet. Hemmed-in enclaves glowed red with smouldering pyres and iron cradles, more reminiscent of a forge than a kitchen. Where had those damned porters gone all of a sudden? 2 cooks strode by, quarrelling so intensely among themselves that they ignored him completely when he tried to speak to them. He saw a porter ducking into a back room, too late to catch him and not worth the pursuit. Berthold went back and forth several times, knowing full well he was wasting time on the job, and he still didn't fully trust Eadon not to use any excuse to spite him. The more time he frittered away, the higher the chance of a misunderstanding leading to punitive measures. If there was one thing Berthold was sure of, he was damn well getting paid for this. Fretting over what to do in the situation, Berthold did the only thing he knew he could. He would go back and find a workaround to finish the job. A thick carpet of steam blanketed the low ceiling, whose misty membrane obscured the narrow corridor leading back to the scullery. As he turned into the doorway, he caught sight of a figure coming down the corridor towards him at a pace. In a fit of panic that it was Rouge, Berthold darted back inside. This momentary distraction proved ill-fated, as he stepped straight into a dolly stacked with plates, being pushed out by none other than Eadon, who shrieked in reflexive anticipation of the impact and its unstoppable consequences. A tale of 3 parts unfolded before Berthold's aghast gaze, as the stack shimmied, shook and fell, then shattered. He beheld the terrible destruction of porcelain over the floor tiles through the mist, as if he were viewing it remotely, or recalling it from a dream sequence. The crash lit up the kitchens like the first crack of a thunderstorm. Berthold felt Eadon's rage spear through him as he staggered back, caught between shock and a futile instinct to catch the fallen towers.
Oh! You mucking idiot! Look what you bloody well gone and done now!
Berthold stepped backwards, equally frozen by the catastrophe. Porcelain shards crunched awkwardly under his boot, reifying the gravity of the situation. Beneath his panic, dim reptilian logic concluded whoever had to pay for this mess wouldn't see a Rons of their own for a month, so it made perfect sense for Eadon to blame him, regardless of whose fault it was. Slower in Berthold's cognition of consequence was his tenuous position of hired help. Would he be thrown out and barred from the tavern, or have to stay and work off his debt with full-time duties? He had no time to be waylaid with such drudgery, yet here he was, sucked into the undertow of this porcelain maelstrom, while his treacherous co-worker harpooned him across the bow. His heart raced while his mind attempted to form words, to utter some kind of coherent sentence that would adequately explain the situation.
This is all your fault, Berthold Forst, and I'm going to make sure Rouge knows it, you clumsy, good-for-nothing rat!
Eadon spat. Eadon leant in far enough to bring them into direct eye contact, punctuating his threat with an angry forefinger he jabbed at Berthold's chest, like said imaginary harpoon. His threat delivered, he stormed off to make good on it. Berthold struggled to process his unjust and untrue accusations amidst the surreality of the steam fog smothering him. Gripped by anxiety, his mind raced to think of a way out of this situation. Innocent as he was, and accidental as it may have been, the writing was on the wall for who would come out of this on top. It was self-evident. In spite of his lowly status, Eadon had tenure, and now he had first mover's advantage. People sided intuitively with the most aggrieved person, usually the claimant of the grievance. There was no point trying to talk his way out of it, so what did that leave? Thoughts of denial and fleeing flashed through his mind. No, there had to be a way to face this head-on. Berthold just needed time to think, to get a grip on this spiraling situation. Standing in this sweatbox, he couldn't even see properly, let alone think of a novel solution. What could he do? It wasn't as if he had a magic wand he could just wave to fix all of... He stopped himself dead. A smile cornered his lips. Insouciantly, he reached out his hand and snapped his fingers. In a puff of magic smoke, a small creature appeared, identical in appearance to the one he had summoned earlier. Only its magical essence distinguished it from its experimentally annihilated companion. Like its brethren, it hopped up and down and scuttled around excitedly in anticipation of serving his needs. He wasted no time setting the Ixie to its task. The recharge time on his Ix-Snap spell was exceptionally short, half a minute to be exact, but every second counted here. Ixie! Its beady yellow eyes locked onto his. In that moment, he knew he had its absolute, undivided attention. He pointed down at the mosaic of shards on the floor. Can you fix these plates? Its big eyes followed his finger like a dog tracking a stick its master wanted it to retrieve. When it noticed the mess for the first time, it squealed with delight at the revelation of its task. Having surveyed the damage, it turned its head back to him and grinned like a child gone mad with devotional glee. It nodded enthusiastically. Then get to work. Do it as fast as you possibly can. I'm about to summon the rest of your brethren to help you. Just as before, the Ixie's hands began to glow with a blue aura as it channeled mana into its unique constructive magic and began to sweep up the shattered pieces into a pile in the middle of the floor. Berthold watched it dart back and forth with inhuman alacrity, waiting out the 30-second minimum for the spell to recharge before snapping his fingers again and summoning yet another Ixie. It puffed into existence and began to peer around at its strange new surroundings. Before it could act up, he was ready with his command. You! Do what he's doing. Fix all of these plates, and hurry! The Ixie leapt to its task and began sifting through the pile its companion had created, pulling out individual shards and dropping them into other, smaller piles. After another recharge interval, a third and final Ixie joined the fixing frenzy. The fourth would not regenerate to be summonable again for a full day, something Berthold regretted now when he needed it most. A tense minute ground by like a mill wheel as he hovered anxiously over their shoulders, watching them meld shards into larger fragments as if they were solving some anti-entropic jigsaw puzzle. Sure enough, the unrecognizable mess began to disappear as the shapes of plates took form in their tiny hands. Berthold watched it all, dumbfounded more than he should have been, considering the spell was his and he'd already seen their powers in action. That had been a scenario entirely of his own creation, with a relatively low risk of punitive consequence, though. He could have said the chair broke as he sat on it, and the innkeeper wouldn't have been any the wiser. Suddenly, a familiar nasal tone drifted down the corridor, protesting its innocence, wheedling its diligence, cajoling its master's urgency to cast blame where it was deserved. Another voice, full of ire and vinegar, berated him as it followed in tow. There was no mistaking either of them. Eadon had returned with an extremely irate-sounding rouge. In spite of the humid cloister, Berthold felt a bead of sweat trickle coldly down the back of his neck. He turned back to the Ixies, who were frantically piecing together the last few plate edges as the two men approached the scullery. Just a little more time. Berthold had to take action, and decided to stall them as long as he could. Once you're done, stack them on the rack here, then disappear. Hurry! He commanded the Ixies as he strode out the door. Berthold found his ears had not deceived him as he was confronted by a red-faced rouge and his snarky blue bottle of a co-worker, Eadon. Berthold, what in the seven hells is going on in here? Eadon told me you deliberately pushed over an entire dolly of crockery he was carrying out and smashed it all over the floor. Oh, he did he? Berthold replied coolly. Rouge's brow twitched in confusion. He ceased ambling along like a bear that had sat on some nettles and stood up straighter. Yes, he says he's been trying to work with you all evening, but you've been refusing to cooperate with him at all.
Oh, yes.
Well, is this true?
Oh, yes. It's all true. See for yourself.
Berthold shrugged indifferently. 3 faint puffing sounds he had been listening for came from the scullery, which meant unless the Ixies had botched the job somehow, his alibi was now set in stone. I don't know why you've taken this attitude, Berthold, but you're going to have to pay for... Rouge stepped around him to get into the scullery, shaking his head in disappointment. Berthold smiled inwardly, savouring the moment of anticipation of his reversal of fortune. This? What the... Eadon! What in the 7 hells is going on here? Eadon, who had stood back to admire his scapegoating handiwork with folded arms and a smug sneer on his face, now looked panicked as he rushed over to the doorway.
But it were...
Eadon spluttered, eyes bulging, mouth agape. Berthold? Right on cue, Berthold turned around and entered the scullery. Rouge's reaction told him the Ixies had done their job exactly right, but he wanted to see it for himself. Sure enough, the stack of dishes stood tall, clean and whole, just as it had before the accident. Yes? It seems I owe you an apology. I've been led on a wild goose chase by this prattling nitwit here. This is excellent work, by the way. Not a stain on any of them. In fact, they look practically brand new, he continued as he turned one over in his hands with a bemused expression on his round face. I take my duties seriously. I can see that you do. I suspect the yarn of your misdeeds I have been spun is the beguiling of the guilty rather than the cry of the injured innocent.
You what? I never done that. It was all broken. He must have switched it while I was gone.
And how would I do that when I don't know where anything is? You wouldn't even tell me where to dispose of the dirty water when I asked. Twice. Rouge's scowl reformed and focused on the now fiercely backpedaling Eadon. Berthold was tempted to lay it on thick, as Eadon had done, but seeing him squirm a little was enough.
He's lying. It was all smashed, I tell you.
Berthold smiled lazily through lidded eyes at Eadon's bluster, taunting him with the knowledge of the cover-up. Then something happened he hadn't anticipated. Rouge dabbed his sweaty brow with his apron and stood up straight with a dispassionate expression. I've had enough. Eadon, give me your apron. You're finished here. Get out and don't come back, not even for a steak. Eadon's mouth fell open and, for once, no words followed. He took off his apron, balled it up and threw it into Rouge's waiting grasp, then turned on his heel and stormed out. Berthold watched him go, suddenly uncertain of how he felt about this turn of events and his part to play in them. Good riddance. Now, Berthold, I believe you are due your pay, Rouge said, turning back to face him with a beatific smile. Oh, yes, if you please, he replied distractedly. Something wrong? I know it's not my place to comment. I just wondered... Yes? Was that necessary? Oh, you mean giving Eadon the sack? Absolutely. You're not the first person he's run afoul of working here. That's how he ended up in the scullery. I thought he'd settled down enough to get on with his meagre duties, but apparently not. I won't have liars and wolf criers on my staff. It's bad for morale when we all work this closely. Right. Yes. Of course. Not you, though, Berthold. You have the makings of an exemplary worker from what I've seen. You're honest, do what is asked of you, and keep a cool head under pressure. That goes a long way in a small kitchen like ours, let me tell you. On that note, with Eadon gone, we're now advertising a vacancy. If you're staying a few more days and need some coin, there'll be plenty of work for you. You'll be paid at the regular wage instead of the temporary staff wage, too. It's not much more, I'll admit, but it's something. Rouge handed him a small pouch, regrettably lighter than Berthold had hoped. He took it graciously, resolving that it would be more prudent not to spoil the convivial moment by asking how much it was. That seemed more like something Eadon would do. With the money in hand, he realized none of this drama mattered anymore. He was free and could leave it all behind without a second thought. Eadon had been sacked for his own incompetence and malignant temper. Berthold had tried to be reasonable and cooperative with him. He didn't owe this stranger any kindness or special consideration of honesty, especially with how he had tried to frame him for the crockery smashing incident. Accident, he corrected himself. Visibility had been poor, his attention distracted momentarily. Who could have expected Eadon of all people to have decided to load up a dolly and do the absent porter's jobs for them? If the nitwit hadn't overreacted in his attempt to blame shift, Berthold could have explained how he could have fixed it all without anyone else ever knowing about it. It was a lot of rationalizations to swallow in one go, and his conscience fought mightily to preserve some better sense of things than the cold aloofness of letting sleeping dogs lie. Berthold was no liar, and yet Eadon's words stuck with him, branded him for his feint with the truth in his own memory. He wasn't happy with his part in this outcome, regardless of its prior build-up with others beforehand. An executioner wore a hood for a reason, to hide his face from others, and so protect his soul from the stamp of his grim deeds. So the folklore went. Berthold was many things, and had resolved to himself before he left home that this new life of adventure would entail casualties and sacrifices in order to become what he sought to be. Not yet, he decided. The blade of his conscience was still sharp enough to bleed him of any dishonest leanings, and so he resolved to tell Rouge the truth. Berthold wasn't sure whether this would anger Rouge or cause him to second-guess his praise. It was simply a risk he would have to take. Rouge?
Yes, Berthold? If you want to talk about more hours, it'll have to wait. I have to attend to my duties. Goodness knows I've wasted enough time back here thanks to that wet rat's ear gnawing.
No, I mean, yes, I would be interested in that. I wanted to tell you something else.
Oh? What is it? Hurry now. I must get back or I'll be out on my rear too.
I need to set the record straight before you do. Rouge looked down the corridor and back to him impatiently, torn between his duty and curiosity for this kernel of truth Berthold had offered to reveal.
All right, fine. But make it quick.
Berthold sighed with relief and launched into the truth of the story. He had the short sequence of points laid down within a minute, but the bewilderment and disbelief on Rouge's face urged him to crown its denouement with a demonstration. So I just snapped my fingers like this. He paused to draw Rouge's attention to his free hand as he positioned his fingers into the seal necessary to activate the Ix-Snap spell. Rouge's eyes popped wide with astonishment as the little brownish creature appeared and began dancing around between their legs, kicking its little curly-tipped shoes up in the air as it celebrated the joy of being in the material realm so soon again.
How bizarre! And it's not dangerous?
Not at all. They're completely under my control, and have a very specific type of constructive magic that is mostly used for building things, or repairing them.
So, if I drop a plate, this little creature could put it back together for me?
Well, yes. Like I said, what happened next was an accident. A costly accident, had it happened to anyone but me. Fortunately, I remembered I could summon my Ixies to fix things. I had hoped to do it without such a fuss, but Eadon stormed off to tell you before I could do anything.
Yes, of course,
Rouge agreed as he stared at the Ixie with quiet fascination. About that?
About what?
Does my telling you the facts of how things transpired change your mind over sacking Eadon? I know it's none of my business and even goes against my own interests, given your generous offer of full-time staff wages. But I would feel dishonest to continue working for you under false pretenses, profiteering from another man's loss. You said you didn't want such people working for you after all. Rouge stood up straight and scrubbed his cheeks and forehead with the corners of his apron as he appraised Berthold's words.
Would you feel better if I reversed the decision and gave Eadon his position back, even though it would likely mean I wouldn't be able to give you the hours or wages I promised just now?
I think so. We both know he needs a kick in the rear. Perhaps this will be enough to set him straight. He was fine to work with when we actually got down to it. Rouge nodded sagely, a wistful look in his eyes. He reached out and clapped Berthold on the shoulder.
All right, Berthold. I will reach out to him and offer him another chance.
Thank you, Rouge.
But there is something I want you to do for me first.
What would that be? Rouge picked up a plate from the stack and casually tossed it up into the air, where it hung in spin for an instant before crashing down and exploding on the floor.
Fix this plate for me, he said with a grin.
It was such a silly request that Berthold couldn't help but smile back. Fine. You want to see how it's done? Watch this. Berthold stepped back and braced his feet before pointing dramatically at the Ixie. You! Ixie! He cried. It snapped to attention immediately, anxiously awaiting his command with big saucer eyes. Fix that plate, he intoned with quiet authority. As before, the Ixie scuttled around, collecting all the pieces and sorting through them. Once its pile was ready, its hands glowed blue with channeled mana as it began the reassembly process. Both men watched the Ixie as it methodically arranged visually identical chips into the coherent shape of a plate. Even in skilled artisanal hands, this kind of replacement would have taken countless hours to replicate, if it was possible at all. The Ixie finished reforming the plate and held it up for his master's inspection. Berthold passed it over to Rouge, who examined it by turning it through all its axes in a way he was clearly accustomed to doing. He flexed on it with both hands and smiled with satisfaction when it didn't break down the middle.
Well, how about that? Good as, no, better than new, he laughed.
Possibly, yes. I believe their magic realigns the microscopic structure of the porcelain in a way that increases its tensile strength, though I'm not certain of this. His explanation washed over Rouge, who merely nodded along politely.
Right, Berthold. Exciting as this little escapade has been, I am truly late, and must return to my duties.
Of course. My apologies, Rouge. I didn't mean to—
Don't worry about it. It was my choice to stay and talk to you. But if anyone asks, I'll blame it on having to sack Eadon. Before I rehire him tomorrow, of course.
Good. I'm going up to my room to fix myself dinner and rest. What time shall I come down to ask you about additional hours?
Tomorrow would be better, since I'll need to speak to Eadon first. There's always a chance he may not want to come back. After all, he didn't love it here any more than we loved him being here.
Tomorrow, then.
Tomorrow,
Rouge echoed over his shoulder as he headed back down the corridor from whence he'd come.